The second raid that takes place, which arguably has a much more infamous and, what shall we say, an infamous significance for Florence, I think is a good way of putting it, is Cornin's raid. Most of us are at least a little bit familiar about Cornin's raid. Now, this man, Florence Cornin, his name was actually Florence, ironically enough, Florence Cornin of the 12th Missouri, he leaves Corinth on his expedition. Now, the point of Cornin's expedition is really just to deprive the Confederacy of as much material support as they can possibly manage. And the way of doing this is just seizing, burning, destroying. By this point, the philosophy was, if we don't get it, the rebels will. And so in order to materially hamper the Confederates' ability to wage war in Middle Tennessee, it was thought necessary to deplete the area north of the Tennessee River at the shoals of any support that it could possibly offer them, including more material, food, fuel, horses. So Cornin embarks on a mission of destruction. He crosses the Tennessee River May 26th at Hamburg near the old Shiloh battlefield. He splits his command. One wing goes up towards Savannah and Waynesboro, Tennessee. The other makes its way down the Savannah Highway, crosses over to the Cloverdale Road, and a detachment under a Major DeFord goes around burning every mill he can find in the Cypress Creek Valley. And Cornin and the main force have a running fight down the Cloverdale Road until they were within sight of the city of Florence by the afternoon on Thursday, the 28th of May. And I'm going to read Cornin's, well, an excerpt of Cornin's report, just letting you know exactly from the man himself what it was that he was doing there and what it is that he did and visited upon the citizens of Florence. He said, I ordered Lieutenant Colonel Phillips to search every house in the place for contraband goods. I recalled the 7th Kansas Cavalry, which had advanced to the right and south of the place. All of the command, except those on duty in the town, were ordered to halt just on the outskirts. The enemy's force was variously estimated and was under the command of Brigadier General Wood, Sterling Alexander Martin Wood. He retreated in 2 directions, hoping by this means to divide my command, but in this he failed, as I did not order any pursuit beyond the town. We found in Florence some 5,000 rounds of canister and 30,000 rounds of ammunition for small arms, which we destroyed. The few wagon shops in the place were engaged in making artillery wheels, and the blacksmith shops in doing other government work, and were burned. After remaining in the town about 2 hours, I started my whole command southwardly and toward the river on my return. About that time, my advance reached this creek. It was attacked by the enemy, who made considerable demonstration in order, as I supposed, to draw away our attention from the immense 10 yards in that vicinity, and the largest in the Southern Confederacy, and the factories that were operating there. However, these were destroyed, and all their contents with them. The contents were worth more than the cost of the establishments and their entire machinery. On the expedition, we destroyed 7 cotton factories, not one of which cost less than $200,000, and the raw material and finished goods in them were worth infinitely more than the cost of the factories and machinery. One of them contained 300 looms and employed not less than 2,000 persons. The loss to the Confederacy in this respect alone amounted to several millions of dollars. In addition to the factories destroyed, we burned during the expedition some 200,000 bushels of corn, captured 69 prisoners, about 200 head of horses and mules, and about 300 contrabands of both sexes and ages. Among the prisoners were 1 major, 1 captain, 1 assistant surgeon, and 3 lieutenants. End quote. Now, Cornin here obviously ostensibly is only prioritizing his force against what we might call war material, military goods, ammunition, factories that are producing goods for the Confederate war effort. I say ostensibly. But another eyewitness of his command, who wrote in an editorial to a newspaper called the Daily Missouri Republican under a pen name, has more details we might color in about Cornin's raid at Florence that show that it wasn't necessarily only military necessities that were preyed upon at this time. First of all, he says, the town of Florence was soon filled with soldiers preying upon everything contraband. In our raid through the country, we destroyed all the corn and cotton, and also burned 6 large cotton and woolen factories in Florence. A building in Florence was burned, which contained upwards of 2 tons of ammunition and powder. Blacksmith and wagon shops and all the manufacturing houses in or near Florence were destroyed. Large quantities of liquor and tobacco were found in a number of houses, but was soon disposed of by our soldiers. It is really amusing to a Yankee soldier to see the effect that a cavalry raid has upon the country and the people. Such a terror and dread is enough to dishearten the cause of the rebel. The people generally deplore their situation, and many are willing that the war should cease upon any terms. So as we saw, as Cornyn put it, this is really not just about military exercise. We're really talking about plunder, psychological warfare to an extent, visiting war upon otherwise normal people who are just trying to live their lives and stay alive. Indiscriminately, going from house to house, from building to building, and burning. Now, Samuel Stafford, the man who had the dragon story that we talked about last time, he's visited by Cornyn at this time. He described Cornyn and his men as, quote, a regular robbing machine. Whenever he made his Southern Claims petition in the 1870s, he left off most of what Cornyn and his men took from the store. This is a page from Samuel Stafford's ledger book saying destroyed by the Federals, May 1863. He left it out of his petition, rightly, because his attorney advised him that he would not get any pay for those items because they were destroyed as the result of depredation and not because of an official military requisition. And the Southern Claims Commission never paid for acts of depredation. So he just left it out. But among the property that Mr. Stafford claimed destroyed by Florence Cornyn were burned 1 family building and outbuildings, property including 15 fine hats, silk sheets, silk parasols, 20 yards of calico fabric, amounting to $2,400. Again, what exactly does the Army have named of silk parasols? This was about crippling the Confederacy from within, not only its capacity to wage war materially, but its capacity to wage war mentally, exhausting the population. And although, it's important for us to realize that, although the Federal Army does not physically occupy North Alabama at the Shoals, they from Corinth are still operating in and out around the Shoals, and the Confederate Army does the same. Cornyn makes no effort, in other words, to take the city of Florence and hold it as some kind of strategic objective. That's beside the point. His mission is to come into town, raise as much havoc as he can, and then get out before the rebels can catch up. This is the character of warfare that has really developed by the spring of 1863, as the Shoals find itself wedged between these 2 wings of 2 competing armies. Now, one more code to this and I'll move on. For everyone in the community, though, this wouldn't have been a completely negative event. And the great example I want to quote for this is a man named Emanuel Mail. Emanuel Mail was enslaved in 1863, somewhere in the west part of Lauderdale County, probably near the Peters Plantation. And whenever Cornyn came through in May 1863, Mr. Mail saw his chance and escaped bondage and followed the Federal Army back to Corinth and began serving in federal regiments as a teamster and other sort of ancillary labor. So it's important for us to know that, I mean, one man's trash is another man's tractor, right? You have a roving band of Federal Army that enter your country. For some people, this would have been as much an opportunity as it would have been for. Now, by early in 63, conscription, Confederate conscription, in the Tennessee Valley really ramps up. And the reason for this is that even though the Confederate government had passed conscription acts back in 62, the presence of the Federal Army here throughout most of 62 prevented the Confederates from really materially conscripting men in North Alabama. But when Buell withdraws, and this becomes more or less a no man's land, conscription really ramps up. And in my work with Southern Claims Commission petitioners from North Alabama, conscription is one of the most common threats. I put conscription at rest because most of these men will refer to being conscripted into the Confederate military interchangeably as being arrested. These are men who are taken under force of arms to Confederate camps and forced to serve in the military unless they could make their escape. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples that I could have chosen, but the ones that I have chosen for you are all men who are in my family. These are my ancestors. Two of them anyway, William Danley and John Wilson Michael. Walter Stutz is William Danley's son-in-law. Now, for a lot of men at this time, as we saw, there would have been an opportunity to escape conscription by joining federal regiments instead. And this is essentially what Walter Stutz says. He was conscripted by Confederates and made his escape. And according to William Danley, he says, Walter came to my house and stated that I'm going against my will, as I had rather go on your side and fight for the Union if I had to fight at all. So men who otherwise would have just stayed home and tried and stay out of it, whenever push came to shove and they were forced to choose sides, probably out of resentment. You know, don't tell me what to do. Do you want me to be a Confederate? Well, I'll just go join the Yankees. So that was definitely part of the psychological impetus. And William Danley, my fourth great-grandfather, joined Thomas Jefferson Seifert's 7th Tennessee Mounted Infantry sometime in the summer of 1863. He and Walter both joined the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry. And I always hesitate to include Walter Stutz here because by the end of the war, there is some very compelling and damning evidence that he engages in some very serious and disreputable, disgusting behavior in the last few days of the war, preying on local civilians. But he was indeed my third great-grandmother's second husband. So family reunions must have been quite interesting, especially because William Danley was called on to testify against him in those proceedings. This man, my fourth great-grandfather, John Wilson Michael, was a man who really just tried and stay out of it, period. They resided somewhere near, if you know Hickory Flat, towards Lexington on the Florence-Lexington Road. That's where Michael resided. He has such a catty attitude about it whenever he's making his claim. He says he was conscripted by General Roddy and taken to Tuscumbia sometime in the year 1863. But, he says, I took a furlough of my own Christmas Eve night and stole a canoe on the other side of the Tennessee River and come home and went to the Yankee lines. That was the 3rd year of the war, 1863, if I ain't mistaken. John Hardy and a young man named Hodge were with me. They came across the river with me. I then went to Pulaski and stayed there until sometime in March. I came home and made a crop. I would plow and watch and lay out, always at night in the woods. I did the best I could. His phrase, laying out, is what they all describe. And his experience is not unique. Men who are trying to just raise their families, attend to their farms, their businesses, they would attend to their farm business during the day, very carefully watching, and they would lay out in the woods at nighttime trying to avoid the conscription gang. His political sentiments, he says, my feelings was bitterly opposed to a separation and felt that the old government was good enough. If I had to fight, I was going on the federal side. I never sympathized one moment with the Confederacy. So this is the experience of my family, and really I think why I tend to lean, as you probably have noticed, more towards the Union side in describing things, but because I know that my ancestors here in Lauderdale County also leaned on the Union side of things, and making sure I give them their voice in telling you all of these events is very important to me. So let's jump ahead and look into some more context. And again, events further afield that are going to directly impact events at the Shoals. So if this seems beside the point, just bear with me. So in the summer of 1863, in light of all the constant pressure from Washington to move, General Rosecrans moves out from Murfreesboro and, in a really swift and bloodless campaign, compels General Braxton Bragg to give up the city of Tullahoma. Bragg retreats by way of the railroad southeast over the mountains back towards Chattanooga. Now, the Tullahoma campaign happens at the exact same moment in time as two other events in the war that really rightly overshadow it. The first is the Battle of Gettysburg. The last day of the Battle of Gettysburg happens at the same day of Bragg's retreat from Tullahoma. And then also the same day, July 4, 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant, after a months-long siege, finally compels the Confederates to surrender the city of Vicksburg. So in one fell swoop, The balance of power in the entire war, and especially in the Western theater, is upended. And Rosecrans is actually quite bitter about the fact that his accomplishment is overshadowed by these larger developments. He says to the Secretary of War, "You do not appear to observe the fact that this noble army has driven the rebels from Middle Tennessee. I beg in behalf of this army that the War Department may not overlook so great an event because it was not written in letters of blood." Well, Rosecrans would just have to be patient and wait a little longer, and he would have his own event to talk about that would be written in letters of blood. But so, this is going to completely change the balance of power in the West and lead to the next scene of action, which is in and around Chattanooga. This is one of those amazing Brady photographs from circa 63, 64. I always noticed that there are so few trees in old photographs of the 19th century. I think that's because they're building everything out of wood. They're burning wood for their stoves, burning wood for their locomotives. So, you know, if there's any trees going around, their days are numbered. But so, Rosecrans is going to just basically walk into Chattanooga. Bragg and the Confederates do not attempt to take and hold Chattanooga. Bragg retreats his army to the mountains of North Georgia and essentially gives Rosecrans a free pass in. Rosecrans is delighted and heady by his recent victories, and he should have been more cautious, because essentially Bragg has invited Rosecrans into a trap. Rosecrans decides to split his army into divisions and try and encircle Bragg in the mountains in North Georgia. And as he does this, Bragg picks them off basically one by one and almost gets them trapped in these mountain passes that are like cul-de-sacs with no way out. This leads essentially to the Battle of Chickamauga, where Rosecrans' forces realize too late that they are in a trap and try and concentrate the whole army together before they all get picked off one by one. And the Battle of Chickamauga that takes place then is a 3-day struggle. It is second only to Gettysburg in terms of the number of casualties. It is the bloodiest battle fought in the Western theater. The weather at this time would have been hot and dry. In fact, many of the authorities, Rosecrans in particular, says that he can't see the Confederate encampments, but he knows they're there, because on the other side of the ridge line, he can see the plumes of dust that are being kicked up by the wagons and the hooves of the horses. Now, as I said, Chattanooga is really a trap, because it's very difficult for them to haul enough supplies for their army to keep the men and animals fed over the rugged country by the wagon roads and the one serviceable railroad that exists. And after Chickamauga, even though Rosecrans does manage to get his army back into Chattanooga, after Chickamauga, the Confederates are looking down on them from the mountains, and it's clear that they're encircled and they're in danger of being starved out. Now, Rosecrans, for his failure, is fired, and in his place is put General Thomas. General Thomas had the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga because he was one of the few federal commanders that really held his ground throughout the battle instead of trying to skedaddle back to Chattanooga. And whenever Thomas is given his charge, his appointment to take and hold the city of Chattanooga, he responds to headquarters, "I will hold the town until we starve." This is certainly not a hyperbole, because by this time already, the horses and mules and the beef cattle that they're trying to drive in to feed and supply the men are starving on the march. They're literally dropping down the wayside because there's not enough hay and corn to feed the animals. Now, I am not going to go into Wheeler's first raid, just for the sake of time, but just know that General Bragg is perfectly aware that the Federals are starving, and he wants to try and hasten their demise by sending cavalry under General Joe Wheeler behind Federal lines to cut the railroad in Middle Tennessee to starve them out. And it doesn't work. That's all you need to know about Wheeler's raid, but he does cross the Tennessee River at Elk River. Now, in order to save this critical situation for the Federal Army, there is a restructuring of the war in the West.